I think it's beautiful that these public officials are getting harassed in public a little bit.
What's the vision of a better society that's driving you to critique this current society's notion of what civil society is?
I guess it's like trails and blazes with the metal getting lost, sticking labels on lists on. Fake ladies and medals get their shit on, made up and murdered like women gliding with their wings gone.
Hey friends, welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And this week we are going to be chatting about something that has been talked about almost to death maybe over the last couple of weeks in the media and on the Twitter spheres and the blogospheres and the Facebook spheres and wherever else. But we're going to be talking about civility and civil society and things like that. So stay tuned for that. Also, I wanted to let you know that we just launched a Patreon account. So if you find value in what it is that we're producing here, please feel free to throw a couple of bucks our way. Patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We don't have anything hidden behind a paywall right now, but Troy and I are brainstorming about extra content and newsletters and things like that, and the possibility of having audience participation where you guys vote on a topic that we engage with. So those things will be coming in the coming months, but in the meantime, if you feel like supporting us, patreon.com/owlsatdawn.
And I will add that we are considering Austin being available for conjugal visits. Just putting that out there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we can't pay for a ticket, but if you happen to be regionally within the area, or if you want to do like a digital sesh, I'm down.
Webcams. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember the movie Demolition Man when they unfreeze Sylvester Stallone and Sandra Bullock invites him to have sex? Do you remember that scene?
No, I don't remember that movie at all.
Oh, dude. Okay. So she invites him to have sex, and then they put on these headphones and they have some sort of virtual sexual experience where this headset stimulates the neuronal processes in your mind that create the sensation of the orgasm, or they create, let's say, the chemical experience of the orgasm. And then he gets like really pissed off and he's like, why don't we just do this the old fashioned way? And she gets all offended. Like, that's gross. Like, it's hygienically gross to share DNA and shit like that. It was a fantastic scene. Anyway, basically what I'm saying is I'm down to do some Demolition Man stuff.
I could see your entire future existence being based upon old Sylvester Stallone movies. That's a good thing to aspire to.
I mean, Cliffhanger was so important on me when I was a little boy growing up that it probably has like these. It sits in like these deep recesses of my mind more than I even realize.
Was Demolition Man the movie that had Dennis Rodman in it? That was a different one, wasn't it?
No. Wesley Snipes.
Which one was Dennis Rodman in, though?
Dennis Rodman was in a movie with Sly?
Wasn't with Sly, but it was something I don't remember. We'll look this up later. This will be behind the paywall for Patreon.
There you go. See, this is the kind of shit you will get if you support us financially.
All right, so for our first segment, we're doing the Shitty Minute. This is where one of us rants about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week, and Austin has the torch. So, Austin, what's got you down?
Hey, Troy, I got a question for you.
Hit me.
If I ask you what a lie is, what do you think a lie is? What is your definition of a lie?
A lie would be an intentionally told mistruth with the intent to deceive.
Okay. You said a word in two different ways in that sentence that is so important. Intent. In fucking tent is required for a lie. People on the internet, please stop saying that people are lying when they're just simply misinformed. It drives me fucking crazy. Yes, people lie. Yes, politicians lie. Yes, people lie when they're engaging in debate. But most of the time in Twitter discussions and debates, people are just misinformed. They make mistakes. And guess what? It's okay to make mistakes. Stop calling everybody fucking liars. First of all, it dilutes the word, makes it meaningless. And second of all, it just increases the sort of dramatic anger and negative affect that you have in political discourse. God damn it, a lie means intentional, with the intent to deceive. You know that what you're saying is wrong, but you're doing it on fucking purpose. That is a lie. Chill the fuck out, people. That's my shit.
No, I totally agree with you, man. You know what? The kind of the worst part about this is for me personally. Worse just in terms of how it affects me, not in terms of the grand effect of of this whole phenomenon. But it totally obscures the role of the dialectic in knowledge, right? You have to go through a process in order to know something, and to understand something at a deep level. And sometimes that means sort of starting at more naive levels and working up from there. And the idea that you would never ever make a mistake or say something that's not entirely true, just sort of assumes we already have all this knowledge. And if you don't have it, then you're somehow morally bankrupt or something. Like, can you imagine like Socrates, like Plato's Socrates, talking to like Theaetetus and being, "What is knowledge, Theaetetus?" And he's like, and they're like, "Oh, it's true belief." And then Theaetetus is like, "It's a lie. It's true belief plus an account, bitch."
Liar! Liar!
Like, settle down. We're getting there. All right. Let's kind of figure things out step by step. All right.
Settle down. We're getting there. Exactly. I know, man. It's so interesting. We had a chat on the Wisecrack movie podcast with a buddy of mine actually came on who's a big time Star Wars guy. And you actually might remember him, Kyle. He was my old boss at a coffee shop in Valencia. Do you remember him?
I remember the coffee shop.
when we were in
Yeah.
school?
You made good ass sandwiches there, man.
Yeah, he was. Dude, they did some good shit there. It's just too bad it was like
What was
too
it called?
ritzy and high end. Bella Via.
That's right. Yeah.
Bella Via Barista Cafe, but it was owned by the coffee kiosk company people.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anyway, we were chatting about sort of intensification. We were talking about Star Wars and the backlash related to Star Wars and the sort of intensification that seems to come with this. I mean, I know people are calling it an echo chamber, and that term seems to be so cliche, but there's something about this feedback loop of anger and negative intensity that's occurring on social media. And we were saying, do you think that the reason that there wasn't the same level of vitriol in like the 70s when, you know, like Return of the Jedi, or the 80s when Return of the Jedi came out and people were disappointed in it, or when people were fighting about stuff, that it wasn't quite the same, or even when the prequels came out, even though people were like, my childhood was destroyed, it wasn't quite the same as it is now.
It was a joke.
Where it's like, well, yeah, and now it's like literally Kathleen Kennedy is on the chopping block of potentially getting fired, right? And it's like the level of intensity and the level of access has made it so, I don't know, it's just a completely different landscape. And I wonder if that. Basically, I'm saying social media, I think, is destroying the possibility for dialectical engagement.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely as much vitriol. I remember in 2000, was it 2001 or 99 when Phantom Menace came out. And there was lots of vitriol. I mean, I certainly had it as someone who was like 14 years old when it came out and loved Star Wars when I was a kid, and that movie was so terrible. But then you didn't feel like you could do anything about it. You were just like, well, George Lucas fucked up. What are you going to do about it?
Right.
Let's just hope the next one's better. And it wasn't. And then you just said, well, okay, maybe the third one when Anakin goes dark will be actually better. And then people said it was better and then it wasn't. But you didn't do anything about it. Now social media, you feel like you have some power to do something.
Right.
Especially if you can amass like a mob mentality on Twitter, which no one got time for that back in the old days of 2000.
We don't have time for it now either. That's the point, isn't it? Or like, it's like we're changing our temporal experience of the world based on outrage.
Yeah, no one's got time, but they find time for it. Just go do something else. Like,
Yeah.
relax.
Yeah. Right. Like, enjoy a beer or enjoy your partner and listen to some good fucking music and go have a vegan burger or a cheeseburger or whatever the fuck you want and actually sink your teeth into it. Taste it. Enjoy it. And stop calling people liars. Give them fucking time, man, and engage with them in some good faith.
Go for a walk.
Love people.
Circumambulate.
Go
Like,
for a walk.
just do something. God.
Real quick, I know it's not my sticky leaves, but this is actually, real quick, let me just slip this in there. There's a book, I don't know if we talked about it, by Rebecca Solnit that's called Wanderlust that I think people should check out. It's really, really fucking lovely, and it's about her experience and her enjoyment of walking, and she engages with the poetry of like Wordsworth and various other people, but not in like a cheesy, oh man, I took that shit in English literature, because I remember I studied Wordsworth in English literature, and I was like, this shit is whack. But it's a really lovely text that's kind of part biography and part philosophical analysis. It's really cool. It's called Wanderlust, Rebecca Solnit. Check that shit out.
Yeah, dude, I don't even want to know how much of the like horror and sadness and depression is a result, at least in part, of people just not walking anywhere. Probably more than we think.
All although I live in a city where people walk all over the place to get everywhere. I mean, they do say, though, that Australians they always rank in the top, like, 5 of happiest countries. So I don't know, maybe. But when you talk to them, they sound, I mean, they're not, like, Scottish miserable, but they complain a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you know how people talk about how like the density of noise has a huge effect on human well-being, and that there's just so much ambient
Yes.
noise constantly in modern society, and that just wasn't the case for most of human history, and our brains aren't used to processing all of it. It overloads our mental processes, and then we like just aren't able to cope as a result. I bet you the same thing exists with walking. Just all of human history has involved so much walking, and now that we don't do it, it's got to have a huge effect on us mentally that we just don't even see.
It's funny you say that. I'm reading a book right now that's actually about this,
You always
about
say that.
speed and acceleration, and I know it's almost like kismet when we talk, Troy. All right, let's jump into the main segment this week. So we were talking. We were. I know I said last week we were gonna maybe have a guest on this week. The guys from Left Out podcast. That's gonna be next week. They are gonna be coming on next week. They just wanted to get their schedules together because only one of them was gonna be able to get on this week, and so next week now all of them are gonna be able to join us. So hold out for that. We'll be talking about economy, economics, and things like that, but in a cool and fun and exciting way. I promise. Don't be turned off by the word economy. That's the whole point for next week's episode. But so Troy and I were trying to figure out what could we do this week, and there's been so much debate and discussion around this idea of civility discourse, right? Of a civil society, and about how it is that we're supposed to treat either people who disagree with us in popular political debate, or how it is that we're supposed to treat public officials when they're eating at a restaurant or when they're leaving their house or whatever. And so Troy was like, why don't we talk about this? And I think that it's a particularly contracted point of contention right now. And so I think it'll lead to some interesting discussion.
Yeah, especially since the idea of civility revolves around discourse and argumentation and all these kind of areas that we talk about a lot. So even though the sort of political side of it may not be super interesting and maybe really banal and annoying to people, but I think the outer edges of it, we might talk a little bit more, are probably more interesting than what's currently being talked about in the quote unquote discourse.
Yeah, I agree. Do you want to start by kind of talking about the article, or do you want to talk about Judge Kavanaugh? How do you kind of want to start the discussion?
I mean, I don't know. There's been so much written about it that I don't even know if we need to reference too many articles, although there was one article that I did enjoy in the New York Times by Michelle Goldberg called "We Have a Crisis of Democracy, Not Manners." But I think just we could talk about sort of what produced the current talking points and the two dominant sides of the discourse, and maybe where they could go wrong. Would that be an appropriate way to open it up?
Sure.
Yeah, so I guess we could say that the idea of civility is a lot older than, say, 21st century American democracy. I mean, civility seems to be a constitutive concept of any sort of like reasoning, right? In order to reason with somebody else, I suppose you need to be civil to yourself in your own personal reasoning, but that seems to be almost like tautological. But to reason with somebody else in argument, in debates, in critique, in even sort of a more symbiotic form, you need to have some sort of constitutive etiquette, right? You need to be able to assume the person's in good faith and wants to get or has some similar goal that you have, like maybe truth or justice or whatever it might be. And so in order for that process to work, something like civility has to exist. And that seems kind of obvious, right? I mean, you can't really have a conversation with somebody who's absolutely unwilling to be uncivil with you. I don't think anybody thinks that's really a possible thing, right? So that seems to be the kind of the history of the term, right? If we're going to have public reasoning, if we're going to discuss with fellow citizens about our preferred policies, if we're going to have a quote unquote conversation, which everyone talks about, right? We need to have a conversation about this topic. Some form of civility needs to exist to facilitate that conversation. So it's a very old and generalized concept, nothing new, right?
Hmm. It sounds like the idea of civility, as you're describing it now, seems to resonate with an idea of justice too. That what we're talking about is and ethics, and so what we're talking about is how is it that we order a society, and so then my question is what is the relationship between civility and justice? So like, yeah, sure, you have civility where you respect other voices and you allow voices to be heard and you engage, and that's a sort of maybe a priori condition for doing politics or ethics or figuring things out. But if if there is no justice within that condition of civility, or if that civility is based on, I don't know, the plundering of lands from indigenous peoples, or it's rooted in that society that is engaging in civil discourse has its comforts based on the exploitation of, the African slave trade or something like that. Is that civility? Like, does that count? And I think that's where you get a lot of tension in this, right? So yeah, this goes back even to Aristotle and his idea of the polis, right? And what he's talking about. And so some people actually, I think in Latin, talk about Aristotle as actually engaging with this idea of developing a civil society. But, I mean, women and slaves and children weren't a part of the polis then.
Yeah, how civil was that?
So,
It was civil is the thing, right? Because civility is whatever the norm is.
yeah, exactly. So it's almost like the very term itself is stained from its very construction.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that when we're talking about civility as being, you mentioned an a priori condition of any sort of reasoning or discourse, right? Public reasoning or discourse. That means it's a means to an end, right? It's not the end itself. If some form of justice or truth is the end, then you could argue that civility is a means towards that, especially if you're doing it in a public setting. And that seems to be, at least in part, true. Like you would need to have some sort of etiquettes around public reasoning in order to achieve some sort of social justice or socially achieved truth. But the problem is people oftentimes ends up treating it as an end instead of a means. Or they end up defining civility not as a means which will produce or get us to that end, and then giving evidence that it will get us to that end as a sort of meta reasoning. Instead, they just say, well, what's civil is what is the status quo, what we already do, assuming it's best and will get us towards the desired goal without ever actually proving it or showing that it will. And so that ends up with the case you're talking about, where civility ends up being just whatever is currently the social status quo, which many times is just incredibly uncivil if you look at it from a more abstract point of view. Certain people will be removed from the discourse, told that they're too emotional to be involved in the discourse, told that their reasons are unacceptable because they're not within a certain window of acceptable options, like Overton window type reasoning, all things like that, right? Which that clearly is not talking about some sort of absolute or objective notion of civility, which gets us to justice.
Does this all derive, you think, from a sort of more foundational logic of civility itself as being the sort of the maintenance or the control over the passions, and that civility sort of maybe derived from Plato and then kind of gets a little bit of steam through certain Christian narratives and skepticism to the drives maybe and the id, and it's about this controlling of the monster, the controlling of the emotion, the controlling of the excess, the like you just said a minute ago, you said, it's too emotional to be involved in civil discourse. Women are uncivilized. Freud even talks about this, that women have a resentment to civilization. Talks about this in Civilization and Discontents, right? And so they have a resentment because they've not been fully included in civility. And it's because of, I don't know, whatever their excessive hysteria or whatever it was that he wanted to talk about, but that somehow they had a resentment to it. And the subaltern, they don't count. And the individuals in the colonized, let's say, the slaves, children, the barbarian, the savage, whatever. Those are all terms that seem to be epiphenomena to a deeper understanding of the psyche that we could probably trace to Plato, Socrates, and maybe before there, but definitely to them, where they're talking about the idea of the sort of management of the soul and the body and stifling the
Yeah, I mean,
passions.
Plato in the Phaedrus talks about the chariot, right? And the chariot is like the ego, and you have two horses attached to the chariot. One is mannered and follows the dictates of the ego, and that's the sort of reasoning or logical side of our soul. And the other is the unruly horse, and that horse is the desiring or appetite of soul, and it's untamed and does whatever it wants and is uncontrolled. And Plato wants to get the soul in line, where the unruly horse is sort of bridled to the mannered horse. Because if the reverse happens, then you have the worst kind of soul, right? It's both immoral and unhappy, and unreasoning. So yeah, that idea definitely goes back to Plato.
So, do you think that there's something foundationally, we might say, problematic with even the language of civility itself, because it's essentially about like stifling excess in favor of management of that which is comfortable or management of that which is quote unquote reasonable? And then we designate these terms as reasonable or unreasonable, but that's already infused with a language of like normative judgment that is skeptical of anything that just simply doesn't fit within, as you said earlier, the status quo. So there's something already inherently problematic about the construction of the word civility itself.
Yeah, so are you coming out with like a Foucault type genealogy of this thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so why don't you riff on that for a sec, because I actually am not fully on board with it.
Yeah, so what I wonder is, okay, so right now, let's say today, we're talking about people need to be civil. That is a condition that is required before we can have meaningful political or ethical discussion. So be civil. But what I wonder is not the word civil just a code word for respectful, which is also a code word for simply obeying a certain matrix of power that has been constructed and canonized as being the way that social interactions are supposed to take place. And then I think if we scrape backwards, let's say, and this is a really bad genealogy, but if we scrape backwards, we can say that canonization of the idea of respectability and of discourse and patience itself is based on it's based on a sort of fear of emotion and passion as such, and it stifles a certain element of human life, human excess, human experience that then folds into social life and social experience and the social excess, which are, again, the women, the slave, the colonized, the subaltern, whatever. And all of those other things, the excessive things, get cut off because the demarcation has been established between what is quote unquote civil and what is uncivil. And the uncivil are the monsters, that's the natural. And the civil are the human, and that's the cultural, or the bedrock upon which civilization is built. And so I can't help but think that within the discourse of civility per se, what you get is this radical demarcation between the natural and the unnatural. And the unnatural in this case is good, right? Natural is bad in this place because natural means savage. Natural means other. Natural means beast. Natural means monster. And unnatural is civility. It's the taming of the monster. It's the taming of the beast. It's the Hobbesian notion of the state. It's the Hegelian notion of the civil society that even tames the state. It's this idea that somehow there are these mechanisms that can tame the unruly outside.
Yeah, so I mean, to use an analogy, Foucault does the same thing with like insanity, right? In Madness and Civilization. And that what we call insanity or madness is, to use a, more popular term, it's a constructed thing, right? And it's constructed by relations of power. Whereas people who would, in maybe an ancient society, be considered enlightened or a spiritual guide of some sort, would then later be called schizophrenic, and it's deemed to be abnormal and in need of a cure or in need of removal from society or something, right? So in the same way, we could say civility from a Foucauldian perspective would probably be something like as you're saying, respectful. So respectful of the current norms which exist, which are not eternal, inscribed in the universe norms, right? They were constructed over time to be this particular way in this particular society for the benefit of those who have power. And so
Right.
civility then just means to respect those who already have power. And that seems a pretty accurate way to look at the way it currently is, right? Because civility means when somebody who's in a position of power can do a horrendously evil thing, like back the imprisoning of the children of immigrants, right, without due cause, and then expect to go and get a meal served by people who were maybe formerly immigrants or something, and then not have that interrupted, right? Not have their lives interrupted by the real life of powerless and poor people. And to interrupt their lives in any sort of way is uncivil, even though those people are just absolutely evil, right? And that obviously seems imbalanced. Like, anybody who thinks that the problem with that situation is that an evil person has had their lives interrupted or is made uncomfortable in some way obviously has the weirdest imbalanced lenses on, right? So that point I totally am onto.
See, I wonder if it goes deeper than that, though. I wonder if it goes, and this is totally a dramatic term, but bear with me because I'm using it with all its rhetorical force. But there's like a form of psychical terrorism, I think, in this idea of civility that goes more to the level of thought itself, more to the level of like the foundational logics by which we interpret the world that then construct how we think and how we feel and how we behave before we can even think about people themselves. And that the people and the social relations are just outworkings of this psychical terrorism, so to speak. And I know that sounds dramatic, but I mean that because I feel like there is a sense in which there is a sort of invasion of affectivity, an intrusion of power into our very being when we talk about civility.
You're talking about like a panopticon of civility kind of a thing?
Yeah, exactly. That we internalize.
Like the policeman inside your head.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, I definitely see that, right? I mean, certainly in the university, right? Civility is a huge constitutive portion of university culture. I mean, if you are at any point engaging in conversation and become uncivil, as long as you don't have power, you're not going to go very far, right? You're going to be removed. You're going to be no longer respected. You're going to be not invited to whatever speaking gigs, probably affect your grades, affect the letters people will write for you until you have power. And then a lot of times you can be as uncivil as you want. And nobody really gives a shit, right? I mean, how many famous stories do we have of like Wittgenstein and how much of an asshole he was? Or Thomas Kuhn was kind of a famous asshole as well. And you can say this about, many academics. And we kind of excuse it, right? Because they're geniuses, so we can excuse whatever little petty parts of their character exist. But that's really looking at the surface level of the phenomenon, right? Which is that you have to internalize these things to succeed and eventually gain that power for the most part. Or maybe you never do because you're just inherently uncivil.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm kind of thinking about the Hollywood industry too, right? And there are all these stories of, I don't know if you ever watched Entourage or if anybody watched Entourage, but Jeremy Piven's character is based on a real life guy, Ari Emanuel, I think is his name, the head of WME. And so the character's name in the show or in the films is Ari Gold. And he's just this fucking asshole, right? But everybody under him who are trying to get to that point where they can eventually become an asshole, they are the ones that are expected to maintain balance and be respectful and play the rules of the game. Whereas he is above the rules. He makes the new rules. And so I wonder if there isn't some sort of inherent contradiction between the power that exists as the exception and the management that exists underneath that authority that is not granted that exception.
Yeah, it's like every sitcom you see where the middle manager, right? Whenever they're around their employees, the people they're supervising, they're total assholes. But then you see them around the people that are higher than them and they're sycophants, right? And so they're two-faced. And almost, it seems like out of necessity. I mean, what is it? 80% of people in America would give up a pay raise to see their boss fired. I think I read that at some point. Everybody hates their bosses. Is it because 80% of all people who are bosses of somebody else are assholes? I mean, maybe in that position they are, but I doubt that many people are assholes just overall. It seems like it's the position, it's the power that creates the asshole. And then you're only an asshole in certain circumstances.
Right. And so this kind of hits on the thing that I was initially talking about with this relationship between civility and justice, is that civility is imposed from on high, but it itself, the position of on high that is making that imposition, is not beholden to any sort of restraints, right? So it's ultimately based on this power, this asymmetrical, this imbalance of power within the sort of structural power dynamics. And the idea of justice itself almost seems as like a necessary, that there are two sort of standards of justice, that within the civil society, civility is a sort of either a means to an end to justice, or that within a civil society there's this balance of what people deserve and how they deserve to be treated, which is a form of like discursive justice maybe. But the power structure exists as the state of exception, right? And they can be fucking totalitarians, and that's fine. So you don't need to have justice, ultimately. And if you only have justice within the framework of civility, but you don't have justice within the sort of macro view of the power structure as such, is that really justice?
Yeah, that's exactly why I brought that up in the beginning, because for me, especially for anybody who's listening to this, they're probably going to agree with this automatically, that the notion of civility is a constructed concept and it serves those in power and yada, 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 right? Like, we all kind of know that. I think probably a lot of the people that are even pushing the whole, we need the National Civility Day, probably that's actually today or something, probably a good portion of those people are not acting in good faith when they're promoting this. They're politicians who feel like they have to represent a certain image to the public to get voted in, and they're just following. They're just kind of followers rather than anything else. But does that mean that we need to sort of get rid of the idea of civility, or maybe some related concept altogether? And I don't think that that's necessary. I think all those critiques that we're just talking about are absolutely true in and of themselves. But to just throw them all away, or to be, say, I'm against civility, or fuck civility, or there's no need for any sort of etiquette of discourse or conversation at all, that seems to me to miss the point. If the point is that when civility doesn't have justice as its goal, but it's instead of an end goal in and of itself, it sort of fails automatically and it sort of lacks any substance, then that means that civility, if it was oriented towards justice, would be worthwhile. And I think we've all seen circumstances and instances of this happening. I mentioned the university culture previously because we know so many instances of when civility is used as a bludgeon against non-traditional students, or people who haven't been inculcated into university culture, and they don't wear the right sweater vests or whatever, right? And that's obviously wrong and serves the interests of the powerful. And I think 5 minutes of analysis sort of excavates that. But does that mean that we don't have any notion of sort of a social etiquette in order to enact justice? I don't think so. Like, I also know lots of times in a university setting where, because of certain notions of etiquette like civility, I was able to learn a lot. You need to have some notion of operating in good faith and trusting the other person to be operating in good faith, if there's some evidence of it, to learn from one another. So you need to give that person room to speak, to challenge you, and to say you might be wrong, and here are the reasons why. I don't think that I have special knowledge, and anybody who tells me otherwise is acting in bad faith and just wants to imprison me and use me for their own ends. And that's going to be my governing assumption as I go through life. Like, that's a really good way. That's an extreme view. I'm not saying anyone actually holds that view in extremity, but that's a good way to have a miserable life. So there has to be a way to say we can reconstruct. We can, now that we've deconstructed the notion of civility and shown that it's the substance isn't there at the bottom of it, maybe we can reconstruct it in such a way that it does actually serve justice.
Yeah. So two things. One is for some reason it's echoing in my mind the language of, and I can't remember if it was Gustavo Gutierrez or if it was Leonardo Boff or if it was like a bunch of people within the liberation theology tradition, but they say something along the lines of, how can you do theology while Ayacucho remains? And Ayacucho is a region I can't remember where it is. It's somewhere in South America. Is it in Peru?
You know the lib theologians better than I do.
Yeah, this was years ago, but it was fucking 8 years ago. I can't remember where it is, but it's a region in South America that is extremely impoverished. Think of like favelas in Brazil, right?
It's Peru,
extremely
yeah.
impoverished. It is Peru, okay. Extremely crime-ridden, and their whole point is that while you have this massive region of injustice, how can you talk about fucking theology, right? This is just, and for them, theology then, in this instance at least, is just theodicy. You're just justifying injustice, right? You're just trying to put a cover over it. So they say, how can you do theology while Ayacucho remains? And I think that this kind of fits into that, is how can you talk about civility in a world that is rampant with injustice, anxiety, etc.? And so there's this set of lectures that I'm reading right now by Ava Cox. She was an Australian sociologist, feminist, broadcaster, policymaker, etc. But the title of her talks were A Truly Civil Society. And in it, she wants to talk about how it is that we can construct this idea of a truly civil society. And I think that fits into what you're talking about, kind of. It's, let's just not presume that the paradigm or the logical structure of civility that popular media is feeding to us is the way that we ought to understand what the word civil means. But let's, after we've deconstructed it, let's rebuild based on this idea of civility as potentially meaning something else, as potentially meaning something that is, one, more inclusive, two, not domineering, and that, three, ultimately stimulates a just social arrangement. And I think that's where there's potency, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I don't want to put words in liberation theologians' mouths, but is the meaning of how can you do theology after Ayacucho? Some people take that as stop doing theology, right? But doesn't it mean
Right.
actually, no, just start doing it differently and about
Yes.
Ayacucho? That's the difference, right? Or like, was it
Yes.
Levinas that said you can't do philosophy after the Holocaust, or was it poetry after the Holocaust? Yeah, I mean, wouldn't the point
Yeah.
be not that you just can't do poetry anymore, but you can't do poetry in that same way without acknowledging the horrors of the Holocaust? That seems to me to be a more
Yes.
important point, right? Because obviously, I don't think anyone says you have to stop doing this sort of aesthetic enterprise or conceptual enterprise because this horrible thing happened. You have to acknowledge it. You can't ignore it or justify it as some of the normal course of things.
Yeah, so here's where like Afro-pessimists and post-colonial scholars and subaltern scholars might come in and say, well, here's a problem. The idea of civility itself is inherently wrapped up in these exploitative power dynamics. So to try to repackage it after Ayacucho, to try to repackage theology after Ayacucho, to try to repackage civility discourse after the exploitations of Western liberal democracy will just simply reproduce those conditions of exploitation, and there needs to be some sort of radical disruption.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not really sure what is meant by that, right? Because the very act of presenting an argument against civility and to instead recommend a different course of action, like this disruption, as abstract as these terms are, aren't you kind of assuming the person that you're in discourse with is going to listen to you as a good faith interlocutor, consider your reasons, and either accept or reject them? Like, that seems to assume a lot of the things that we include in the notion of civility. Now, if by that they just mean civility has been so damaged that maybe we should have a different name for it, or we should reconceptualize it entirely and just ditch that concept as we know it, I guess that's fine. But that's just talking about matters of degree then, not matters of kind. That's more about the packaging than anything else. And I'm fine with talking about different packaging if that's the issue. But the idea that there should be no communicative norms at all, and just a free-for-all of individuals speaking out their quote-unquote truth, that seems to me have no endpoint. It has no goal. Certainly not justice.
Yeah, now I know you're not saying this, but I can just hear somebody saying how very Habermasian of you, right? That you're still too stuck within this idea that there is this potential for communicative discourse to lead us through the drudgery of injustice. And I think that this is why there's a lot of confusion then, this narrative of punch a Nazi, or like, fuck it, just harass these people when you see them in public. If Sarah Huckabee Sanders is at a restaurant, fuck it, because it's just about power at this point. It's just about let's bully them and knock them into submission because fuck them, right?
Yeah, good luck, right?
Judge Kavanaugh, fuck Judge Kavanaugh, let's not even give him a hearing because fuck the Republican Party and fuck these other people. Let's just smash them. And so I wonder if there are these tensions that are kind of, they seem to be circling around this, and I'm not really sure where I come down on it because I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough when you apply it to individual circumstances, right? Because when you hear about people going up to Mitch McConnell in the streets and playing or yelling and screaming at him and playing like recordings of babies crying and stuff, and it's like, I mean, like, I don't disagree with the point you're making. I'm not really sure what you're achieving because Mitch McConnell don't give a fuck, right? That dude is just
he got into his armored SUV and took off.
Yeah, if you think you're achieving something with that, I mean, do you think the people that hold pictures of aborted fetuses outside of abortion clinics, like, are they achieving anything? I don't think so.
Well, maybe what they're achieving is the strengthening of solidarity within a community of like-minded individuals,
Sure.
right? Like, so I have people that tell me all the time, like, oh, what does protesting achieve? All you've done is, shut down a freeway. But what you've done, even if you haven't made an initial impact, like an immediate, like, because of our protest, therefore Donald Trump resigns and the utopia is ushered in. No, but maybe what you've done is you've enacted an instance that deepens a sense of one, solidarity, and that 2, kind of gets eyeballs attracted to it. 3, maybe it's just a chink in the armor that you're just kind of chipping away. Like you're in prison and you're just scraping away at the wall just a little bit each day. So maybe our expectations need to be adjusted. Maybe it's not about changing Mitch McConnell's mind and getting him to step down and dismantling the Republican hegemony or whatever, but it's more about these smaller victories.
Yeah, I think you're right. I shouldn't be so dismissive of those things because, I mean, evidence does show that protests have much more effect on the individuals protesting than on the outside world most of the time. Like, we think the civil rights protests are like the be-all, end-all, right? Well, they changed everybody's mind instantly, and then everything was better, right? And that's just obviously a whitewashed version of history. It's more about politically radicalizing the people who go to the protests and the networking and all that kind of stuff. So that is absolutely true. I think the ultimate point that I was getting at is I don't think anybody actually wants to just not have a society anymore or believes it's all just about the expression of power and that's it. Now, does that mean that we should go high when the Republicans go low and vote for Kavanaugh because he's himself is civil and he's
give him a fair hearing?
Yeah,
guys.
I mean, that's obviously bullshit, right? Because these people are clearly just being subservient to power, which is the bad notion of civility we just talked about, which does not serve justice. That's why you should reject it. You should reject the civility that serves the interests of power and is unjust. which clearly that is. So in that case, absolutely the Democrats should try any way to block Kavanaugh, although it probably won't be possible. But that does not mean that we just give up on the idea of building a truly civil society and reconstruct that notion so that it does serve justice. It just means rejecting the ones that don't. So reject the notions of civility that are racist and that are sexist and that are ableist and that are everything else, right? Though that's usually how civility is used to bludgeon the powerless in the interests of servility, right? And that's the notion we should reject.
Yeah, it's when the idea of civility becomes a social debt to the power structure. I'm really interested. I mean, my research right now is really interested in the idea of debt and speculation and guilt and things like that. And so one of the things I'm really trying to work through is what are these mechanisms of guilt that then inform economy in the way that we tend to think about it later on, but even just as a sort of social mechanism. And the idea of civility discourse itself, part of the reason maybe that I'm so sensitive to it right now and maybe I would say opposed to the language as such is because I see it almost as being this imposition of a credit mechanism that reinforces the unjust dynamic power structure. So you are being unjust, therefore you are guilty. You owe a debt. Correct yourself and repay your debt. How do you repay your debt? Get in line. Be more respectful. Just be a silent participant in market transactions. Go to work, shut up, do your job, and make your boss money. That's how you then get back in line so that the guilt mechanisms don't impose greater quote-unquote interest rates, if this metaphor makes sense, right? But the more that you take out loans, the more you become indebted to these guilt mechanisms, the more pressure, the more of a demand that is being set upon you, and the more of a sort of pariah you become within that sort of power structure. Because the power structure itself, and this is something Agamben talks about, is not subject to the rules of itself. It exists as that state of exception. It is in this state of indecidability itself, where it is potentially totalitarian at any point all the time. And it's that constant threat that it could just kill you or exclude you or annihilate you or whatever, whether that's literal or whether that's more metaphorical or rhetorical. That threat is always looming, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger the more that we allow civility discourse to take hold. So my thing is, fuck civility itself. Let's just stop using it. And that's kind of maybe me being a little hasty, but that's kind of my instinct right now, which is why like these lectures by Ava Cox are really lovely, because she's talking about this idea of a truly civil society. It's, can you do theology while Ayacucho remains? Well, it's redoing theology. It's re-understanding civility itself, which is a reorientation and a restructuring of society as such.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that if the sort of married concept is a better society, what it would look like, rather than just
right.
Let's try and just burn it down. Yeah, because that somehow will automatically create the lines of free expression that will enact utopia or something. Like so I like that social debt metaphor a lot, because it's has a strong like Judaic sort of history, right? The idea of sin as a kind of debt. And so you think about the prophets of the Old Testament, right? Very uncivil people a lot of times. You think about how Nathan questions David and Jeremiah was Jeremiah to Israel or Judah?
I can't remember.
But
yeah.
Old Testament theologians, we're sorry. We forget about our Old Testament theology. It's been too long.
It's been a long time.
For some reason, I think it's Judah, but I could be wrong. They're uncivil, right? They're questioning the kings. They're doing things that are considered to be inappropriate and uncivil. Even Jesus himself, right? There's lots of uncivil things. He walks into the temple and starts wrecking shit. He questions Pharisees. He curses at them, right? Calls them names. All sorts of things that would be determined to be uncivil. But always with the notion of what the actual sort of ideal version of a civil society, a better society would look like. And that drives them to critique civility. And that's the most important point for me is, what's the vision of a better society that's driving you to critique this current society's notion of what civil society is? Because that has to exist, I think, for that critique to actually be effective. Otherwise, I think it ultimately just falls on deaf ears. It ends up just being sort of the
Mm.
sort of, I don't want to say like animalistic, but sort of just being, it's just like a expression without any meaning, without any purpose. And
Mm.
that just isn't terribly effective, I think.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And then I can't help but also think, so I used to date a woman who was half Trinidadian and half Lebanese, and she used to always tell me that just white people are afraid of emotion.
Probably true.
And I have talked with and again, this is the other thing that I wonder. Like, I've talked with a lot of people, and I tend to kind of date or hang out with people who aren't of like European descent, let's say. And I get this all the time. It's like, fucking white people, man. You guys are so afraid of emotion. Like, it's like this stoicism that is embedded. Like, and when someone's, they're going through like a manic phase, white people are always like, especially dudes, it's like, I have to control this. It's okay. Don't make a scene in public. How do I deal with this? I must control. Whereas a lot of times they're like, fuck it. Just let it out, man. Like, don't be so goddamn afraid of the expression of a little bit of mania. That's okay. It's all right to get a little crazy every once in a while.
That can actually
And
be
so I
civil.
wonder, too.
That's the thing.
Well, okay.
If you've ever been to a metal show, you can actually engage civilly by running into people, as long as you then help them
but
up
that's already
afterwards,
within.
right? It's
Okay, I love this. Yes, that's right. And punk shows. I remember I was in a mosh pit. I got my shoe ripped off. I didn't know where my shoe was. Hundreds of people. All of a sudden, I get a tap on the shoulder, and some dude came across the mosh pit and gave me my shoe. After he probably like knocked me on my ass and punched me in the face. And then I put my shoe back on and I go back in and start moshing, right?
yeah, that's a kind
So
of
there's a civility within rules.
exactly, and it's meant towards the flourishing of that particular experience, right? Now, it doesn't always work that way, but it can. So the same way, civility doesn't mean being quiet, folding your hands, and raising them when you have a question. Like, it can in certain circumstances, maybe, but it doesn't have to look that way. You can actually have lots of free expression. In fact, maybe you can only have free expression within a certain set of rules. Certainly, jazz improvisers might tell you that. But you think of like,
that's right.
one of my favorite examples is like Buddhist monks. They'll have like their doctoral dissertations. And you would think of a Buddhist monk as being more like, the stoic vision that we have of Buddhist monks, which is just taking turns and following like Robert's rules of parliamentary discourse, whatever the fuck they're going to follow, right? When actually they engage in lots of like yelling, and it seems unformatted from our own perspective of what doctoral dissertations are supposed to look like. But it's all within a certain kind of set of rules that helps enact the best form of discourse as they conceive of it. And so, yeah, this can be extremely creative and full of free expression. But you want to have rules that help purpose that towards some goal. And as long as it's directed towards justice and fairness, then that's good.
Yeah, so the idea of nomos is popping into my head, right? Of law. But nomos not as being the way that we think of liberal control mechanisms because of social contract theory or something along those lines, but rather as being like I'm trying to think, a way of ordering a given social setting where there's respect and flourishing and a stimulation of desire and joy and individuality, but that doesn't stifle by creating a sort of unitary, abstract kind of setting. Does that make sense? I'm trying to figure this. It just popped into my head. But like, most people think of like the law, for example, in the Old Testament, nomos, or the idea of economy, right? Which is this idea of oikos comes from the idea of house, nomos is the idea of law. It's not like law rigidly imposed over your house, just like the law of the Old Testament, nomos, as it's translated into the Greek, right? It's not like this law like we think of, like, if you don't do this, you get your hand cut off. It's not punitive and retributive and restrictive necessarily. It can just be about ordering your given society within norms, within accepted rules, within conditions that you... Now, that can become punitive and that can become domineering. I mean, that can be disciplinary. Foucault would probably talk about the idea of the disciplinarity of norms. That can lead to that, but does it necessarily mean to that? And even if it does necessarily mean that there is some form of disciplinarity that exists within norms within a given society, is that necessarily bad? Or is that just the way that humans create their social arrangements? And so the question is, how do you create better norms? Does this make sense? I'm totally rambling.
Yeah, no, I totally get you. I mean, I was thinking about Apostle Paul, right? I mean, he critiques the law, the nomos, as being problematic because it didn't actually achieve the ends it was supposed to achieve, right? The law of the Jewish law was supposed to separate them out and then enable them to deliver God's promises to Abraham, to the world, the whole world, and bless the whole world. It didn't work. Like, it didn't happen. So he says, well, the law's now been bastardized, right? That doesn't actually achieve it. Jesus came and said, actually, the law has to apply to everybody. I mean, the promises, have to apply to everybody, not just to the Jews. And so that was Paul's whole gospel message, right? Is that everyone is Jew, Greek, slave free, men, women are one in Christ. And that was basically just a way of saying there's a new society, a new notion of how to live together that is against the law. It's not against all law. Yeah, it's a new nomos. It's not separate. It's actually sort of equal and bringing people together. It's community, not separation. And so we're as an analogy for what we're kind of talking about, that's sort of the notion, right? Critique the current nomos. Maybe even reject the term civility entirely because it's been too bastardized. That's fine. But then have that be driven by the new vision of society you have, rather than just critique for its own sake.
Well, I think that's fucking beautiful, my friend. We were actually I think I wrote a little blog post, and I think this kind of hits at what we were talking about in the blog post on our website, yeah?
Which one?
The one recently where I was talking about like leftist nihilism,
Oh, yeah.
and you were saying, there's something about value theory here, and this idea of that needs to be understood. If we don't have this vision for an alternate society, how is it that we can sort of overcome being thrown into negativity or sort of feeling lost or whatever? And I think this kind of fits into that a little bit.
It all fits together, man.
It does, dude. I will say this, though, just to kind of like wrap things up. I think it's beautiful that these public officials are getting harassed in public a little bit, because I think that there's this presumption, there's this entitlement that people who are representatives of a democratic republic, that somehow they're above critique, or they're like outside, that they've lived behind these fucking protection walls for so long. I love it when people accost Mitch McConnell at his house. Like, I saw this one where his wife was like, why don't you just leave him alone? No, he answers to us. He works for us, motherfucker. I'm not going to leave him alone. Let's never leave him alone. And the fact that you presume that he should be left alone means that you are so entitled in your power that you have completely lost the plot on what it means to be a represented elected official, or a representative elected official. And she's an elected official too. So it's so telling that that is her instinct. Leave him alone. Let him be. Be civil. There are means for this. Cast your vote at the ballot box if you really want to say something. No. Fuck that shit, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're promoting the idea of democracy as the solution to it, when clearly, when the president lost a popular vote by 3 million votes, democracy isn't actually the governing governing mechanism, right? For who's elected. So obviously we can't use democracy at this point, and we increasingly won't be able to as more gerrymandering occurs and more people move to the coasts. So yeah, that's obviously bullshit. But yeah, I mean, to use an analogy, talking about accosting Mitch McConnell in public, if someone hit on your girl in a bar in a really obnoxious and obvious way and was like trying to pick her up when you were right there, like, what would you do about it?
Punch him in the face.
You'd probably tell him, like, back the fuck off, right? First. And if they kept doing it and kept doing it.
And then when he's laying on the ground, I'd have been like, then you should have backed off, motherfucker. No, yeah, you're right.
Eventually, like, you get in his face and you're uncivil, right? At first, you're like, back the fuck off. Like, you're civil about it.
Or you do the passive-aggressive thing where you just swoop in and just make it known that you're there, so that then she kisses you, and then you're like, yeah, bitch, that's right, she's going home with me.
No, but he keeps doing it. That's the thing. He's obnoxious about it.
Oh, and he's harassing her, and she's feeling uncomfortable.
Like, he's clearly in bad faith, right? He's not in good faith, like, hey, I'm just trying to be flirtatious. Like, he's clearly trying to, like, fuck with you. Eventually, you'd get uncivil because he's not going to stop, right? He's not going to stop if you're civil. Yeah. He's not acting in good faith here. He only has his own personal tyrannical interest at heart. So eventually, you're going to have to be uncivil. So, and that would be accepted, right? Now, you shouldn't, like, take out a gun and shoot him. everyone would say that you've gone above the boards there. But you should be uncivil. Like, you should get in his face and tell him to fuck off, and even push him if necessary if he
Yes.
refuses to get out of there. So how is that any different when a representative is using the fact that they represent their citizens and are doing evil against the public's wishes with that power? Yeah, I mean, if you're not going to get in their face, when are you going to get in their face?
Exactly.
You don't shoot them.
Yeah.
And in this analogy, it would be, like attack them or physically hurt them, because you're not achieving anything by doing that, right? But being a little bit uncivil actually sometimes is necessary, and we would generally call it actually appropriate in certain circumstances.
It is, because it's the enactment of democracy that's being withheld from us because of the power restraints.
Yeah, exactly. And you need to be strategic, right? We're not saying go and like shoot people or whatever, obviously, right? That's the same as shooting the guy in the bar. Like, you're wrong and you should go to jail for the rest of your life if you do that, right? But
Right.
just being quote unquote civil in the sense of asking him politely to leave, he's using that against you, right? He's using your timidity against you to get what he wants. So you can't do that anymore.
It's a form of agency restriction. They have agency that you don't have. Your agency runs into limits, and by standing behind the protection of civility or their bodyguards or representative democracy, they are restricting your agency. Even though the idea is, and this is where you get this paradox in democracy, the idea is that you should be able to have a level of freedom and potency to express yourself.
Yeah, if it's taken away from you, then you got to do something else.
That's right. Yeah. And that's when it's good to not be a white person and let emotions out. It's okay, guys. I'm learning this. I'm a white dude, so I'm learning, man. I tend to be nonchalant about some things, and it's like, I don't care, man. Whatever, dude. It doesn't matter. No, care about things and let that emotion out. It's okay.
No, man, I only get emotional on this podcast. That's it.
And during Laker games.
Yeah, that's true.
And during Red Sox games.
Yeah, not as much though. Like, baseball is like it's the white person's sport. You're not allowed to have emotions.
It's the white person sport. It's the white person sport where Latin Americans are better at it.
Well, yeah, did you hear that, right? That Brett Kavanaugh has like 6 credit cards or something and $200,000 in debt, all spent on baseball.
I heard about that.
It's kind of perfect, right?
Yeah.
And I bet he thinks that bat flips are bad, and that you shouldn't celebrate home runs.
Oh, God. If baseball had a little bit more, I mean, but there is some passion, but if baseball had some more characters, because they have characters, but it's always like, oh, this guy dyes his beard black during whatever. Or, they're all growing out playoff beards. They're so wild and zany.
Yeah, right. They drink craft brews. Oh, my God.
Oh!
Yeah, baseball has a lot of characters, but they're not allowed to be characters. Unlike basketball, where everyone's allowed to express their individuality. It's so much more entertaining for that reason.
This has been an episode of Basketball Apology with Troy Polidori.
Regularly recurring.
Regular recurring.
Got a day to discover you slaves getting paid, getting rich on days off.
All right, sweet. Well, let's get into our Sticky Leaves section. This is the part of the episode where one of us gets to tell us about what it is that is giving us meaning in a world that is often devoid of meaning. Troy, you drew the lot this week, brother. What's giving you meaning?
So my Sticky Leaves is going to be kind of a weird one. Well, I shouldn't say weird. Maybe sounds weird coming from me if you don't know me. I think if you've listened to this podcast before, and if you know me like you do, Austin, you know that I really love music, play music, enjoy a wide swath of different genres, old, new, classical, whatever they are, right? And my Sticky Leaves is that there's actually good country music.
Wait, contemporary or
Some,
like, are you talking?
but here, you know, people say like, oh, I like. You ask them what kind of music they like. They're like, oh, yeah, I like everything except for country and rap. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, it means that they're white and they like pop music.
Exactly, they like top 40 music. They don't actually like any genres at all.
Yeah.
That's what that means. And so now the people who say like they don't like rap, then that's just like they don't understand things, or they're just not willing to go outside their comfort zone and try and understand why different cultures are different. Like, that's one thing, right? The country thing, though, there's so much shit country, and like almost all pop country is complete shit, right? And so I was reminded as, you know who Casey Musgraves is?
No. Wait, why do I know that I know that. Why?
She's like one of the big female country stars right now. And she just released an album this year that's huge, like top country album of the year and stuff. And I'm not a huge fan of hers, but she's definitely the best of what like the really poppy, glossy side of contemporary country is. And so I get in debates sometimes with people who just are usually music aficionados, and they just think of country as being an inherently just terrible artistic genre. And I think that's actually kind of judging it in the same way that these I only like things that are not country and hip hop people judge hip hop, looking at sort of club rap and being like, well, that must be the entirety of the genre. It's just people who want to bump uglies and do Molly, and they listen to trap music, and that's the whole genre, right? Which, like, if you want to do that, it's fun. Like, I don't give a shit. But there's so much great artistic, intelligent hip hop out there, right? Not even just in the underground, like even popular stuff. And country has that too, both old and new. There's so much great old country. I mean, talk about like Woody Guthrie and Doc Watson and Hank Williams and John Prine. And of course, everyone knows Johnny Cash, right? Merle Haggard. And my personal favorite, Townes Van Zandt, who kind of straddles the country folk divide. But so much great American music comes out of old country. And of course, bluegrass as well. And the new stuff, there's not as much great new stuff, but there's still stuff out there. I've been listening to Gillian Welch lately. She's a country artist that's contemporary, and she's really good. And it's not any of the sort of glossy, terrible pop country. It's kind of
Gillian spelled with a G, like Jillian, but Gillian.
Yeah. And Sturgill Simpson is another one who is a really fantastic contemporary country artist. Both very artistic.
Doesn't he do
great
like
songwriters?
Meta-modern? What's it like? Meta-modern fucking
Meta-modern sounds in country. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Songs Ohio is another one of my favorite groups. They're defunct now. I think the lead singer died. But there's so much great stuff out there. And I think the general message I want to send to people is that every genre of music has good stuff. You got to look for it, right? Because people wouldn't have fallen in love with it if there wasn't good stuff out there. Even if 95% of it's trash. If you listen to this podcast, you know I like metal. 95% of metal is trash. Like really trash. Probably more metal is trash than any other genre. Probably up there with country, right? As far as just how much of it's trash.
Right.
But the 5% that isn't trash is worth it, and it's pretty easy to get that nowadays. You don't have to wade through a million CDs at Warehouse or Tower Records to find the good stuff, right? Or like find a cool looking cover and just hope that the music's good. Just ask people who are knowledgeable, and you can find it. There's so much great stuff out there. I've been going through the Woody Guthrie's whole back catalog lately. Because a friend of mine recommended the Ash recordings of Woody Guthrie, and they're so good, man. Like, this dude was a blue collar fighting for the labor movement, right, and for social justice. Back in the Dust Bowl recordings that he did are so fantastic, talking about people struggling in the Midwest and South in that period. There's just so much good stuff out there, even of country, and so you should be open to it. And if you want to get drunk and kick your dog and let your wife leave you, then you can do that too. That's pretty damn country.
Drive your pickup truck. I'm not going to lie, dude. I have a fantasy of moving to like outside Charleston and living in some sort of rustic cabin-y kind of house thing and just like reading and writing and podcasting and listening to country and folk and Americana shit for the rest of my life. I don't know if I actually would enjoy it, but the fantasy sounds appealing.
Yeah, dude, is there anything cooler in American history than the big tent folk music? Meaning music made by poor people? I mean, like, jazz was originally that way. Obviously, blues, the old blues in the 20s was that way. Bluegrass and old country is that way. Folk music was that way. So much great stuff has been made in like the Americana, right? That's just you gotta get back into that stuff.
Can I share a potentially sad story?
Do it.
I heard that Robert Johnson, who, for those of you who don't know, Robert Johnson is a famous blues guitarist who supposedly sold his soul at the crossroads to the devil, right, to acquire his guitar playing prowess. I heard.
I think
because
Tommy
he's got such a
Johnson
very.
was the first one, but I think Robert Johnson
was he
got
the
a
first
piece of
one?
that as well.
Okay. But Robert Johnson is like, when you talk to Eric Clapton, talk about his greatest influences, and Hendrix, that like the influences of Robert Johnson, right? When you listen to Robert Johnson's recordings, he has a very unique voice and style of play. I heard that it may be that the recordings were sped up, not intentionally to deceive, but just because they're older recordings, and the way that the recording devices were established is they were recording at a higher speed. And so that actually what we're listening to is a sort of doctoring because of technology, which is kind of sad, but also kind of interesting at the same time.
That is pretty interesting. I did hear that Robert Johnson played up that story like huge because he thought it was funny.
About
and
the
he wanted
crossroads?
yeah, about that whole thing. Like he's got several songs kind of about it, right? So
Right.
I do enjoy the fact that he played it up kind of like metal bands do, right? Like black metal bands play up the whole satanic thing just for effect.
Right.
They do it a lot more, right? Like corpse painting the whole thing. But it's kind of similar, which is I think is pretty funny. It's a tried and true formula.
Yeah, I mean, there's something nice about myth creation. Here's the thing, man. I'm starting to become more and more inclined towards just enjoying life as an artistic performance. And so many people, like, you look at like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and all these like conservative critics. I look at them so much and I'm like, man, you guys just need to like read some poetry and watch some movies and maybe indulge in fantasy a little bit more. You guys are too literal. I feel like there's like this literalism of life, that life isn't literal. It is a fantasy. As a matter of fact, the literal interpretation that you think you're living is really itself also a fantasy. But it's like if you're following our book club, it's a form of nihilism, right? It's the inflation of a particular narrative that you think is literal, but it's not really, because it too is a performance. So just indulge in the myth of life and myth creation and things like that. And so part of me is kind of like, oh, this idea of like he sold his soul to the devil, or his recordings maybe were sped up. It kind of contributes to this poetic utterance of the life experience that I think is kind of fun and fascinating.
Yeah, to give a call back to what we were talking about earlier, it's part of this whole social media landscape, right? Where everything you do is part of your brand and part of who you are. So like you can't really engage in like the absurd unless the absurd is your brand. If you're one of the, the ironic posters or part of like weird Twitter or whatever,
right.
where you have to be absurd. So you're not allowed to even not be absurd really. So you can't just like engage in like ridiculousness or just like the fun you would when we were teenagers, right? And you would go and like be creative and like mess around with like running shopping carts into each other and breaking your arm or whatever. And it's ridiculous and stupid and absurd, right? But part of that's like a healthy growth mechanism. And we just can't even have that anymore, it feels like.
Yeah. Fucking, I know. This is what I'm talking about. My fantasy, man. Move to the country, just listen to a Woody Guthrie and Gillian, whatever her name was, all day. Have my little wood shop where I make like bookshelves and things like that. For people who don't know, I used to work as a carpenter, so I like working with my hands. I just don't get an opportunity to do it, and I make bookshelves sometimes. I'll make bookshelves and make tables and chairs and shit and paint them and just read philosophy and podcast and engage in local politics. And I mean, that's
so you'd
the dream,
podcast,
dude.
you'd podcast, but you wouldn't listen to podcasts. That would kind of be the life, right? Like podcast, but then don't engage with anybody. Just put it.
But
out
if I'm
there.
all alone out there, I gotta listen to podcasts because it's a form of friendship in a way.
Okay,
Like,
you can listen to podcasts, but you can't engage in social media with anybody.
okay, I'm down with that. Yeah. So please support us on Patreon so that I can realize my vision of living in the woods and no.
Yeah, please support us on Patreon because I want to buy a banjo. I'll learn how to play. So I'll need enough for weekly lessons as well, please.
And you can track his progress if you become a Patreon subscriber because we'll give you private secret recordings of. No, I can't do this anymore. I'm not good at marketing
be
and
torture.
branding and selling. I'm not. I don't like selling myself.
I'm just gonna upload Sufjan Stevens songs and hope nobody notices.
Yeah, exactly. All right, sweet. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Like I said, next week we should have the boys from Left Out podcast on, where we're going to talk about the idea of what the fuck is the economy. We're going to talk about debt. We're going to talk about something called modern monetary theory and crisis and things like that. And I think it'll be, one, educational for people who are like, what the fuck is the economy? But two, they're first of all, they're well read, but also they engage in it in such a way where they're kind of they're very approachable, and they're not like super like overly technical and nerdy that kind of would turn people off. So I think people are going to enjoy it. I know I'll learn a lot. I'm sure Troy is going to have a good time learning with what they can with what they can tell us. Yeah, like and subscribe to us on iTunes. Give us a 5-star rating. Leave us a review. What else?
Visit us at owls@dawn.com. If you leave any comments about the episode, we'd be happy to engage with you there. Or email us at owls@dawnpodcast@gmail.com.
Twitter, owls_at_dawn.
There too.
I think that's pretty much it, brother. Anything else you got to say?
Buy me a banjo. Das Vidania, Amerikanski.